Good evening. It's good to see all of you here tonight. This could be a very quick lesson tonight because, number one, there is nothing in the Bible that forbids a person being cremated. So that's all we need to say, right? I think that primarily the reason that most people have strong feelings about cremation is that many of the connotations that are placed upon it, burning a body, is a negative connotation as we go through the Old Testament scripture. Many find it surprising that the Jews practiced cremation as a positive thing. Many people find that surprising that there are some places in the Old Testament. According to the Cremation Society of North America, in 2016, the number of cremations rose to 50% of people who die are now cremated. And it's rising more and more in the metropolis areas because there's getting to be smaller and smaller areas for people to be buried. Our cemeteries are filling up, and there's just not that much room for burial plots. The average funeral for just a plain Jane average funeral costs between $6,000 and $8,000. However, a cremation costs about $1,000 to $2,000 at the maximum. There's another method that is free to us, that's available to us, and that's donating our bodies to science, where after they have performed various surgeries and things like that for science students to learn the inner workings of the body, they're able to then cremate the body, and they send back the remains, or as they call them, cremains, to the person that sent the body in. Since cremation is becoming more and more popular and more economical, we need to know as Christians, what does the Bible say about it? And should a Christian do it, or should a Christian abstain from it? Those who oppose the idea of cremation oftentimes go to the Old Testament and look at all of the negative aspects regarding a person disposing of a body through cremation. I'm going to have a hard time not getting those words mixed up. As we examine these particular verses, we're not going to look at every verse that has to do with the burning of a body, but we're going to look at a lot of them. And so get your Bibles out, and you might want to mark some of them. But these are the ones that I found that I think illustrate what we're talking about the most. Genesis chapter 19, verse 24, the Lord rained brimstone and fire on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of heaven, so he burned those people. In Genesis chapter 28 and verse number 24, it came to pass that about 3 months after Judah was told that Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has played the harlot, therefore she is the child by harlotry. So Judah said, bring her out and let her be burned. She was actually pregnant at the time with twins. However, later on, Judah did not have her cremated or burned, instead when he found out what the situation was. Exodus chapter 32, verse 20. There Moses took the calf that was made, and he burned it in the fire and ground it to powder, and he scattered it on the water and made the children of Israel drink of it. Here, burning is associated with destroying that which is wicked, that which is evil in the sight of the Lord. They would burn it to where it was no more. Leviticus chapter 20, verse 14. If a man marries a woman and her mother, it is a wickedness. They shall be burned with fire, both he and they, and that there may be no wickedness among you. Also in Leviticus chapter 21, verse 9. The daughter of any priest, if she profanes herself by playing the harlot, she profanes her father, she shall be burned with fire. In Leviticus chapter 10, perhaps one of the most well-known, Nadab and Abihu. Remember, they offered strange fire before the Lord, and God rained fire out of heaven and destroyed them. Fire went out from the Lord and devoured them, and they died before the Lord. In Numbers 16, verse 35, we have the account of Korah and the 250 men and God swallowed them up with fire, those who opposed Moses. In Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 25, you shall burn the carved images of their gods with fire, and you shall not covet the silver or gold that is on them, nor take it for yourselves, lest you be snared by it, for it is an abomination to the Lord your God. So here we see that God wanted all idols destroyed with fire because they were an abomination to him. All idols were destroyed with fire because they were an abomination toward God. If you'll remember, after Joshua had defeated Jericho, nothing was to be taken from that place. But you remember Achan took the idol, and he took some gold, and he took some silver, and took a garment. And as a result of that, they were not able to fight the next battle. And then Joshua chapter 7 and verse 15 tells us, then it shall be that he who is taken with the accursed thing shall be burned with fire, he and all that he has, because he has transgressed the covenant of the Lord, and because he has done a disgraceful thing in Israel. Then Joshua, verse 24 of chapter 7, then Joshua took all of Israel with him, took Achan the son of Zerah, the silver, the garment, the wedge of gold, and his sons and his daughters, and his oxen, and his donkey, and his sheep, his tent, and all that he had, and they brought them to the valley of Achor. And Joshua said, why have you troubled us? And the Lord will trouble you this day. So that all Israel stoned him with stones, and they burned him with fire after they had stoned him with stones. Then they raised over him a great heap of stones still to this day. So the Lord turned from the fierceness of his anger. Therefore, the name of the place has been called the Valley of Achor to this day. So there you have a cremation, again, as a result of wickedness. Another example comes from Josiah, who was doing his best to restore the Jews back to following the law of God. There was a prophecy made in 1 Kings chapter 13, verse 1 and 2 regarding Josiah before his birth. It says in 1 Kings 13, verse 1, and behold, a man of God went from Judah and Bethel by the words of the Lord, and Jeroboam stood by the altar to burn incense. Then he cried out against the altar by the word of the Lord and said, O altar, altar, thus says the Lord, behold, a child, Josiah by name, shall be born to the house of David, and on you he shall sacrifice the priests of the high places who burn incense on you, and men's bones shall be burned on you. So the prophecy was fulfilled, and you can read about the fulfillment of this prophecy in 2 Kings chapter 23, verses 16 through 20. Here we can see the burning of the priest's bones, and that it was a defilement of that altar that had been used to worship a false god, 2 Kings chapter 16 and following. Now, we could look at more passages in the Old Testament, but I think these are sufficient, and they all say basically the same thing, that when someone was burned, it was to remove them from the confines or from the grouping of the Jews. It was always to wipe out wickedness. And that's why a lot of people have the connotation that to be burned is something that is wicked. It denotes wickedness. But that's not always the case in the Old Testament, and it's for certain not the case in the New Testament. When we get into the New Testament, some people say, well, what about the lake that burns with fire and brimstone? Talking about hell. Well, again, that is what is the punishment after death. It has nothing to do with our physical bodies being burned as a matter of disposal of a human body. We need to understand that all these instances that we've looked at have to do with destroying idols or punishing those who were breaking the law of God. And that God was trying to get them not to follow false gods, but for them to understand just how bad it was to be an idolater. They have nothing to do with what was done to a righteous person's body when they died. We do find through the Bible that most of the time the custom of disposal of a human body was burial. Just like today, most of us, we know that most people are buried. That's changing. Burial was the most common custom of laying a dead body to rest. In Genesis chapter 25 and verse 8, Abraham breathed his last, and he died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people, and his sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in a cave. In chapter 25 and verse 10, there Abraham was buried with his wife Sarah. In chapter 35 of Genesis, verse 19, Rachel died and was buried. In chapter 35 and verse 29 of Genesis, so Isaac breathed his last, and he died, and he was gathered to his people, being old and full of days, and his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. And then in Genesis chapter 50, we read of Joseph had his father embalmed, and they buried him. Then we find out that when Joseph died, his children carried his bones out of Egypt and buried him at Shechem, Joshua chapter 24 and verse 32. Moses was buried by God, Deuteronomy chapter 34 and verse 6. He was buried in the valley of the land of Moab. We don't know where, except that it was in the valley of Moab. Remember when John the Baptizer was executed by beheading? His disciples came and took the body away and buried it. In Acts chapter 5, verses 5 through 10, we have the story of Ananias and Sapphira, that after they sinned, they were buried. Stephen, in Acts chapter 8 and verse 2, was buried. Burial was the most common practice that a person's body was dealt with in the Old Testament, and it is considered an act of respect and honor. If you'll remember in 2 Samuel chapter 2, the men of Judah came there, and they anointed David king over the house of Judah, and they told David, saying, the men of Jabesh Gilead were the ones who buried Saul. However, if you'll remember in context, what had happened to Saul and his sons? Remember, they had been executed, they had been beheaded, and their bodies were hung on the wall, and there they were left for animals to come to be defiled, for people to come by and ridicule. And so these men of Jabesh actually took down those bodies and burned them, and then took them out and buried them in a place where no one could find them to desecrate them even further. We also learned that an unburied body was an abomination. It was considered a defilement of the land by God. Deuteronomy chapter 21 and verse 22. If a man has committed a sin deserving of death, and he is put to death, and you hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain overnight on the tree, but you shall surely bury him that day, so that you do not defile the land which the Lord your God has given you as an inheritance. So burial was something that they did right away. Ananias and Sapphira, within the hour, they were buried. In a matter of 3 hours, they were buried. There are many examples of those who went against God's law, that were not allowed to have a proper burial, that were allowed to stay above ground, and there the animals and what have you destroyed them. Who can you think of right off the top of your head? Jezebel. Jezebel was left right on top of the ground, and the dogs came and ate her. This happened in 2 Kings chapter 9, verse 35 through 38. Jeremiah actually pronounced a curse upon some of the Israelites in Jeremiah chapter 16, verse 6, that involved them not being buried. It was considered a disgraceful thing not to be buried. Jeremiah 16 and verse 6 says, both the great and the small shall die in the land, and they shall not be buried. So it was a defilement of the body and a defilement of the land as well. Jeremiah chapter 22 and verse 19, here's a similar prophecy about Jehoiakim. He was buried, he shall be buried with the burial of a donkey, dragged and cast out beyond the gates of Jerusalem, just left out in the garbage heap, basically. If all we knew about cremation was this that we've talked about to this point, you would probably think, well, maybe cremation's not such a good thing after all. But we might conclude that it's not for Christians. However, I want us now to stop and to look at some of the positive things that are said about cremation. I want to show you that there is nothing wrong with cremation and that it does not matter how a person disposes of the human body when we're finished using it. One thing we have to keep in mind is that a person would have to go back to the Old Testament to set a precedent that if there's anything wrong with cremation. Even if there were a command not to be cremated in the Old Testament, would that be binding today? No, none of the Old Testament is binding upon Christians unless it is restated in the New Testament by the commands of the apostles and by Jesus. Then that would not be bound upon us today. There's no direct commandment in the Old Testament. There's no direct commandment in the New Testament on not cremating a body. So there in and of itself shows us that there is nothing wrong with doing that. You can search the whole New Testament through and through, over and over, and there is no condemnation of taking a body and burning it. Let's revisit back to 2 Samuel chapter 2 and verse 4, here with the body of Saul and his sons. In verse 4, he says, "And the men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. And they told David, saying, the men of Jabesh Gilead were the ones who buried Saul. So David sent messengers to the men of Jabesh Gilead and said to them, you are blessed of the Lord, for you have shown this kindness to the Lord, to Saul, and you have buried him." But notice that David is commending these men for showing a kindness for dealing with the body of Saul as they did. But if you'll remember, in 1 Samuel chapter 31, Saul committed suicide. He and his 3 sons die, and the Philistines come along and strip them of their armor and cut off Saul's head and attach him and his sons to the wall. And that's when the men of Jabesh Gilead come in, take them down, and burn them, and then bury them. 1 Samuel chapter 31, verses 11 and following. They took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree in Jabesh, and they fasted for 7 days. So it was a matter of respect that they burned these bodies. We find out that they burned Saul and his sons first before they buried them, and they did not burn these bodies to punish them, but out of a matter of respect, out of necessity, they cremated these bodies. Another passage is one that is overlooked many times in the Old Testament, is Amos chapter 6, verse 9. And it's a very confusing passage that I cannot fully understand everything, but in that particular passage, but it talks about if there's 10 living in the house and they all die, you are to take them out and bury and burn them one after another and make sure that they're all burned. And it actually basically is showing a matter of respect that that person is taken care of, the dead. And we see then by this time in Jewish history that the Jews were burning bodies instead of burying bodies. It's not a warning against, it is a warning against not taking care of the dead and to burn them, to take care of them as they should out of a manner of respect. Some have the idea that somehow or other, if you burn the body, that it will somehow affect the resurrection. That there has to be a body entombed in the ground somehow or other for that body to be resurrected on the last day. But this simply is not true. It's not what the Old Testament even teaches. Did you ever think about the fact that there are many who have died in many different ways, that the body is moved into several different places? You consider somebody who's buried at sea. You consider somebody who's been rent by animals or something like that. The body is not necessarily all in one place. Do you think God is able to resurrect that person? Certainly he is. In Ecclesiastes chapter 12 and verse 7, the scripture says, "Then the body will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit does what? Returns to God who gave it." So God's able to take care of it. He knows where we are. In this passage, he's talking about how bodies will return to dust, but our spirit will return to God who gave it. In a very similar way, in Matthew chapter 10 and verse 28, Jesus says, "Don't fear the one who can kill the body, but cannot kill the soul, but rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell." So burning a body does not do anything at all to the soul. The soul is kept by God. We should not worry about what happens to our bodies. God will take care of that. He knows how to do that. Whether it takes 100 years or 1,000 years for our bodies to turn to dust, or if they're turned to dust in just a matter of moments in a fire, then God is able to raise that body. I know this is kind of a dark sermon to be thinking about this kind of things, but I think that as we contemplate as times change, it may get to the point that there is no place to bury, and therefore we have to have some other form of disposal of the human body, and that it's perfectly fine for us to use cremation as a matter of doing that. Another good point can be made from 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Here Paul says, "Even though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, but have not love, it profits me nothing." Paul delivering his body to be burned. This point would never be made if it had been made sinful for us to burn our bodies. Paul is not saying that at all. Paul talks about giving his body to be burned, something that is a noble thing. There's nothing wrong with it. There is nothing scripturally wrong with burial or cremation. I think about this. If God is able to create me from the dust of the ground, he's able to resurrect my body from the dust of the ground just as easily. No matter how long it's been or how far apart those particles might be, God is able to do that. So we need to stop worrying about how our body is disposed of, and let's focus our attention upon the soul, and make sure that the soul goes home to live with God, and that God is able to judge our souls. A couple of things that I thought about as I went through this, as customs change. You know, it used to be that people would go to the cemetery to visit the grave of someone that they love, and that's a very time-honored tradition. It's interesting to me that now they supply an urn, and oftentimes the urn is placed in a place of honor within the home. Some churches even will have an ossuary, a place where they would place these urns within a wall or within a column in the church. Just like churches used to have cemeteries, now they have these ossuaries where they would put the cremains in that place. I've also noticed that now one of the things that they do is they make a locket that has a little bit of the ashes within the locket, and you wear that locket. What a close way to keep someone close to your heart. A very honorable way to keep somebody close and personal to us. One thing that you need to do, and to do it soon, for we know not when we're going to pass from this earth, is talk to your family. Talk to them about what you think is best. I know that I don't care what you do with my body. You could just roll it in a hole. It doesn't matter to me. You can burn it, whatever it takes to get rid of it. That's fine with me. Whatever is cheapest and whatever brings the most honor. That's the thing. So you need to talk to your family. Let them know that it doesn't bother you one way or the other, or if it does bother you. There's some people that say, I don't want to burn. I don't want my body to be burned. I would much rather be in a casket in the ground. That's the way I want it to be. And if that's your choice, that's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that. However, there's nothing wrong with being cremated either. All right, that was a whole lot of material in order to cover what I think is interesting, that the Bible is neutral on this particular subject. So whatever you feel is best for you at the time is perfectly fine. One other thing, I have a nephew that is donating his body to a forensic college. To where they lay the body out to watch what happens to it over a period of time, so that police and what have you can see how long a body has been in a certain set of decay and what happens at particular times. And I thought that was a very honorable way to pay tribute pay it forward at the end of our life. And then when it's all said and done, they will cremate the remains and give it back to the family as well. So I thought that was a very interesting thing. There's a lot of options out there. Talk to your family about it so that when the time comes, there's not going to be bickering over it. I know that a lot of times there's a lot of strong feelings. Get those feelings out in the open and taken care of so that the last memories you have is not fighting over what are we going to do with the body of our loved one. All right, that's our lesson for tonight. We're going to offer the Lord's invitation for those who might be thinking about the fact that their life is not going to be eternal on this earth, but they need to get ready to serve the Lord. This is the last Sunday of the year, but it's also the last Sunday of the decade. So this is an extra special time for us to make a lasting commitment to the Lord to be all that He wants us to be. Will you make a commitment to serving the Lord as best as you can in 2020 while together we stand and sing?